that concludes the more PBS pledge drive portion of the evening. But we're here to celebrate Gina and Insurrecto, which is a great book that I hope you all read, and we'll hear Gina read. Reading the book, I was thinking about this classic essay by Kwame Anthony Appiah called "Is the Post in Post-Colonialism the Same as the Post in Postmodernism?" And the essay is all about the way where when you read post-colonial literature, it's often about some kind of traditional, authentic past, like a traditional African mask or sculpture, whereas postmodern literature is sort of about a future that's created by literary experimentation. It's not about authenticity. The two actually require each other as opposites. The post-colonial is the anthropological, the report of the witness. The postmodern is the thing that's invented in the metropole that involves experimentation, genius, things where you don't need to have history, but you can just riff off having great footnotes or having self-referential metafiction. What I love about Gina's work, and I think the work of a lot of experimental writers that we have in this space, is that it's a way of having that post mean the same thing, of having post-colonial writing be also postmodern or post-structural writing. And I've often thought that that is actually a real space of liberation, of being a bohemian writer, an outsider, alternative, or a weirdo. If you're my age, you may remember a time where literary fiction was defined about like irony, which meant a specific thing. But I've also thought irony was the domain of something like W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness, the idea that being in the colonial situation means that you might have multiple ways of thinking about something. Gina's work is about these sort of dual rebellions, a rebellion against imperialism, but also a rebellion against the realist novel. If you read the body of her work, you'll see that she's an interrogator of freedom moments in Philippines history. But often when someone is trying to be a national chronicler, there's a burden to tell the authentic truth and to narrate the nation. But in Gina's work, she both narrates the nation, but also undoes any possibility of narration. In Bibliolepsy, the main character intersects with the origins of the people's movement against Marcos, but she's sort of a Hélène Cixous-style lover of books. The Revolution, according to Raimundo Mata, intersects with José Rizal, but this story is intersected with footnotes from 4 different, often maniacal readers who are commenting on the text. Insurrecto, which is the latest book, which has gotten rave reviews and many award nominations, is about a different moment in revolutionary history, which is the Balangiga resurrection and then massacre in Samar. It's one of my favorite resurrections in anti-colonial history, in that, as you all know, it involves a charismatic, almost mythical heroine, revolutionaries who are dressing in drag and crawling out of coffins before opening fire, and great martial arts. I feel like all of the book is about, much like Viet Nguyen's Sympathizer, it's about film as a form of mediation and representation of colonial history. But it's a much more experimental book. And it's a book, like a lot of these books, about what is the epistemic way of thinking about colonialism. How can you narrate it? How can you talk about it if you are not a stable person and you are the product of the time after the Spaniards and the Americans came and after neocolonialism? So it's a book that's not just what does it mean to write about the Philippines after Jacob Smith said he wanted to reduce the islands to howling wildernesses, not just after No Limi Tangre, but also after things like Elvis in Hawaii or The Thriller in Manila, or after the age of the blogosphere and disgruntled Filipinos in the diaspora writing snarky messages for each other. It's also how to write about this after the age of haute couture. One digression is that I feel like Gina is kind of like Flaubert, a poet of commodities. There's a sort of weird precision in describing objects, like every detail of clothing, movie, a name of a street, type of automobile, where you suddenly realize that we live in a world where everything is mediated through commodities. And it has this weird effect where not only is the narrative itself constantly being translated and reinvented, but our entire social reality is also manufactured. And you begin to wonder, do we actually exist, or is it just commodities? The other thing I would say is that the anti-colonial theorist Alberto Memmi once wrote against the idea of dolorism, the idea that the only way you can write about colonialism is through talking about trauma and focusing on pain. And Insurrecto is a great book of witness. There are many stirring moments of moral righteousness and thoughts about what does it mean to think about history. But it's also a book of humor where you find disquisition in the nature of the Ewoks in The Return of the Jedi. And it's a great book of joy. So let's give Gina a hand.
Thank you so much, Ken. And I don't know what to say. I mean, I think I'll just cry afterwards. I think that's just what I'll do. And thank you, all of you, so much for coming. It's a huge, huge joy to be here at the Asian American Writers Workshop, which I consider, apart from my home in New York City. It's just a place where I feel that the work that I do always has this space and relevance that I'm going to be very, very honest, I don't get anywhere else. So thank you all for coming here. Thank you all for, in some way, celebrating Asian American Writers Workshop. The person that I first knew who was at Asian American Writers Workshop was Eric Gamalinda. And he's this Filipino writer that I absolutely love. He is, of course, an epigraph in my novel, so I may as well, in honor of Eric, read the epigraph. Grief is a nation of everyone, a country without borders. I roam the avenues of it out of habit. Summoned to testify on everyone's behalf, I'm sticking to my story. It's better not to talk about the wounded or the moist remains of the disappeared, but there's always one who can tell in the packed amplitude of crowds. We are so many bodies, my friends. We all move in the same direction, as though someone had a plan. That's from Eric. It's from DMZ and Amigo Warfare, and Eric was the person who introduced me to Asian American Writers Workshop, and I think it makes sense to honor Eric with this novel. I'm going to start with chapter 20, which is actually the first chapter of my novel. So what else? The insoluble puzzle at the heart of the labyrinth. For the mystery writer, it is not enough to mourn the dead. One must also study the exit wounds, invite the coroner to tea, cloud the mind with ulterior motives. The translator and mystery writer Magsalin has undertaken, yes, no pun, some of the above at previous incidents, but the insoluble puzzle at the heart of the labyrinth, the secret within the secret, is not hers to bemoan. That is up to the dead man's kin, who are, fortunately or not, also dead. It is said, for instance, that the writer, Stefan Real's mother died in Auschwitz, his father of shrapnel wounds before the war started. The writer, Stefan Real, had a wife. She's a widow. Her heart must be broken. Magsalin cannot do that for her. For the mystery writer, there are clues. Sheaves of paper with marginal notes, clippings of newsprint events of general interest. Everything could be a sign, and a word has at least two meanings, all of them correct. And it is not right to jump to conclusions, especially when it becomes apparent that one's sorrow is misplaced in this instance. Her protagonist, what do you know, is female. The dead male writer that prompts the story waves goodbye. It turns out the woman is a filmmaker of moody artistry whose scandalous father precedes her fame. The woman's name has an arbitrary Italian flavor, Chiara or Lucia, with the first C glottal and the last C a florid ch. She is Chiara or Lucia. Magsalin has yet to decide the name, an act that must occur without the readers noticing. Both names mean clear or lucidity or something that has to do with light, something vaguely linked to eyesight, hence to knowing, then to blindness or paradox. Choosing names is the first act of forgetting. So in this novel, there are two women who go on a trip to Balangiga, Samar, where that massacre in 1901 happened, where Filipinos in Balangiga rose up against the American garrison that occupied their town, killed 48 Americans, and in retaliation, the Americans killed around 2,000 or 50,000 Filipinos in Samar. And it led to the massacres in Samar by the Americans led to an investigation in 1902. I read all of it, the U.S. Senate hearings on the Philippines. And actually, in my view, changed the prosecution of the war by the Americans in Samar. But Chiara is a filmmaker, and Magsalin is the translator that she has to take her to Samar. And she gives, Chiara gives Magsalin the script. So this is chapter 28, a secret metastasizing thing. Magsalin shakes her head at the script. Starting a movie with a voiceover by a society photographer who discovers her soul amid butchery will turn off local viewers. Anti-imperialists are touchy people. And as a trigger warning, the device is risky. In a movie about a Philippine war, why use a 19th century Daisy Buchanan, some socialite photographer who, unlike the truthful shallowness of the Gatsby original, will turn out to have a bleeding heart? The idea is so 1970s, when politics mattered, and even the heiress Patty Hearst had a cause. Or that journalist in Reds, the Diane Keaton character, who nurses the Yankee commie John Reed back to life in the Warren Beatty epic. Sure, it's nice to have a woman's voice in a time of war, but does she need to be so white? Whatever. It's so obvious that the WASP photographer, actually a mutated Ukrainian Jew, is a stand-in for the generic consumer being enticed to know the story. But that soundtrack, Magsalin hates it. It sticks in her head. She heard these songs, including the bovine, marginal declensions, the whoa-whoa-whoas, all throughout her childhood. A sad trick, this pop track, that the soundtrack of the Philippine-American War is stuffed with bloated late Elvis, earworms of his crass decay, listened to over and over again, at least among her mother's generation, will not do. Why start with Elvis? Elvis is from her uncle's time. She marks the script, scratch, scratch, scratch. Magsalin had never liked the songs, though it surprises her now how all the tunes she thought were absolutely Filipino, like Are You Lonesome Tonight? An annoying kundiman if she ever heard one, turn out to be Elvis. Except My Way. My Way is Frank. To sing My Way, you are not allowed to deviate from Frankish phrasings or you will be shot. I'll just say this, that it's actually true that there are the so-called My Way murders, where if you sang, there were places where if you sang My Way in the wrong way, not according to Frank, you will die. So what happened with the karaoke places in the Philippines for a while was that they didn't have My Way on the song list because people might die. The karaoke murders of My Way singers are a badge of honor in some fastidious dives. But Elvis has this phenomenal stature among local drunks. No matter how anyone mangles his desperate songs, they always bring tears to someone's eyes. He was inescapable in her childhood. But at the time, Magsalin had no clue. She grew up innocently with her uncle's drinking bouts in Leyte, in which the songs seemed to spring from the bamboo groves, and grown men sang soulful versions of creepy ballads while sopping up Bahalina Tuba, their local wine. Her uncles in Manila still bring in fresh gallons of this wine from cargo ships that look as if they had known the days of Magellan. And in Manila, they translate their provincial guitar fests into insomnia-inducing mechanical nights of karaoke. The novel actually has like the Chekhov version, you know, the Chekhov's gun version. If you start with karaoke, you have to end with karaoke. It strikes Magsalin that the congenital link between drunkenness and song and her uncles might be an ancient tumor, a fever of the islands beyond anyone's control, so that Elvis and Frank are daemons, or maybe cancers, forms of visceral necrosis, a genetic malady and not necrotizing corporations. In America, Magsalin kept confronting these doubles, met cultural puns, repetitions of details from her homeland that have reverse or disjoint significance in this simultaneous place, as if the parallel universes of Elvises and Neil Diamonds in both the Philippines and America were a dark matter of the cosmos that eludes theorists of the world's design, that she has Elvis in her bones, a secret metastasizing thing, just as she has Nipa huts and the crazy graphics of jeepney designs occurred to her as a blow. And once on a visit to Nashville, when all she heard in this museum she stumbled into, which contained only Elvis's cars, was all Elvis all day, all the time, as if she were still stuck in some fiesta guitar strumming session with her uncles amid palm trees with no way out. The idea struck her, oh gee, what if Manila is necrotized in America too? Scar tissue so deeply hidden and traumatized no one needs to know it. One is in the other and the other is in one, she thought, feeling ill in Nashville. Herself overdubbed, multiplied, intercut, and hyperlinked, but which is to be master? She wondered, feeling dizzy, about to fall. She also had too much Kentucky bourbon. So I'm going to read from, so there are dueling scripts in this, in the novel, where Chiara's script and Magsalin's script, you don't quite know exactly which one is which. And I'm going to read from one of the scripts. So this is from the 1901 script in Balangiga in Samar. The breeze of the Habagat. So this is chapter 27. And that one was chapter 28. So this is later in the, whatever. The breeze of the Habagat provides a false sop against Balangiga's heat. In addition, the convento's location against an inland river gives the men of Company C a daily noontime reprieve. You have to be nuts to get up at the height of day to trudge toward the water. Siesta, according to the Filipinos, meets the rational demands of the island's weather. The laborers about town are released every morning from their jail to hack at trellises and random fruit trees. Hemp-wrapped jackfruit that look like ugly swaddled infants, fragrant fruits with the texture of sand called chicos, and that prickly fruit that always looks deformed with buboes, the atis, and when you scrape its inside, it is like everything else in this island, deceptive. Atis looks demonic but tastes like Eden. It is the custard of paradise. The men look sullen in the blinding swelter, but everyone on the island looks put out anyhow. Randall's the sergeant, hates this part of his job, babysitting docile mutes in the wilderness. These prisoners look harmless enough, as agile with bolo knives as the chief of police with his arnis sticks, and under his eye the men at their hacking are energetic and careless, nimble and inept, but Randall's does not give a fuck. Randall's the sergeant would regret what had got him here if this shithole offered him the refuge to remember. His butt is full of maggots and his prick has a rash, pimples rot his face. His pale pink flesh is eating him alive. His limbs look swollen. I did a lot of research on syphilis. Sometimes the sores appear in his nostrils, sometimes around his balls. His fingers look like baobabs, pustular skin swelling about his death's head, rings like botanical knobs around his infested scars. This is his reward for his courage in China, consisting of guarding the temples of the gates of heaven of the Empire of the Sun, another skull-numbing job. The diseases of the whores of Tientsin Pekin or maybe Nagasaki, who knows, this unrelieved sensation. Every orifice in his body is corrupt. It does not matter that the rashes also occurred in Indiana before the wars and in Fort Warren before the trenches. Fort Warren is also where the bells ended up, so whatever. The Balangiga bells that were looted by the Americans. Memory, anyhow, is no aid to his wounds. His short-lived days in Malacanang Palace were his only solace. For some reason, his squad station at the mansion in Manila had calmed his crotch. When for 2 days he had guarded Fighting Fred Funston's meek prisoner, the tiny, shocked general of the bandits, his insurgent person already divested of all signs of revolution, many souvenirs, medals, combs, and spoons had already been looted by Fighting Fred's men. So Randall's only spoil was one of the man's sorry, blood-spewing spittoons. As he had stared at the miniature martyr, General Aguinaldo of the Palanan jungles, Randall's could only think he looked like a Chinese doll he had once seen abandoned in a yard in Taku. Those 2 days in Manila's river, the Pasig, had soothed Randall's, as if the chilly air that swathed the inert captive were an omen of its own suffering's finality. Though Griswold, the surgeon, says his body's sense of reprieve is just his imagination. At no season in Manila is the air ever chilly. It does no good to wash every day. These neat-nick people here love their baths, which they take shamelessly in the open air like babies. Any form of cleansing makes his scabs tingle, opening up fresh pains. Rot from his dried pus makes his scabs tingle. Oh, it embarrasses him to give his underpants to the women. Washerwomen are all gossips anyway, and in private, Randall's washes his clothes himself. Still, to his mind, a smell of rat, sewage, and humid blood always cleans his breeches. But when he falls into this self-pity, he must remember that he came here across the stupid seas to save these sons of bitches. He's a vessel of God. Though what that preaching woman in a uniform, that captain/pastor, Tommy Connell, knows about his dumbfuck soul, he could care less. Cocksucking cunt. Pardon my Chinese. Captain Connell coddles the natives. Laws against touching the women, laws against drinking the wine, beware of fraternizing with the locals. What the hell was a good fuck anyway but goddamn benevolent assimilation? Randall starts giggling to himself, lifting one hand to his handlebar mustache to keep it in its greased place, his eyes smarting as involuntarily his hand feels up his pants. Fucking prick. It hurts. He giggles so much he's shaking, his woolen body a blue blur in the steaming sun. This squalid man, who looks like a walking mop with bald patches. Kalbo nga sipid nga yawa nga naglalakat-lakat, waray dito, waray dinhi. She hates having to go near him. I'm waray, so that's waray. I don't translate it, so sorry. She hates having to go near him. She thinks clumps of skin might fall off him if she merely breathes by him, and then his putrid flesh might rain upon the air like the ash of kaingin. Some parts of his flesh look like the crinkled skin of roasted pigs. I actually read this once at a restaurant where they were making lechon, so it's pretty funny. The popped, crunchy parts with bubbled fat. The children called him calavera ngalayaw. Corpse at large. That's no wonder, but to be honest, he looks worse. Kaluoyi, have pity on us, Frank used to say. And once upon a time, she did. It annoys Kashana Nacionales that Frank's voice muddies things up. He'd repeat her words and say them like yawa and bugas, just so she might laugh. Her words in his mouth had a childish joy. She had never disliked his people, she said to him, until you actually showed up. But isn't it good, Frank said? We are teaching you English. We are putting up the telegraph wires. The better to tell us what to do, the better to spy on why we do it, she said. She told him, there are consequences to your desires that you will regret, no matter how much you imagine your evils are unintended. That's deep, he said. She sighs, thinking of Frank Pitrin, as the chief calls him, her lover boy. He's not a bad man, just an unconscious one. Kasiana Nacionales prefers her venom pure, like the water she carries to her father. She had always been the fierce one as a child, though maybe that is no distinction among the Nacionales clan. Even the chief, when he has doubts now about the tactics, consults her. She looks down at the rosary against her neck. She must remember to list the details of the breakfast operation for the chief one more time. The keys that will be stolen, the bells that must be rung, the costumes men should wear, wait for her signal with the rosary beads. A good number of men must go for the barracks, a good number must go for the mess hall, but the best men must go for the officers, the captain, the lieutenant, the surgeon. They all need to die. Count them, count your men, she keeps telling the chief. You need to have enough. Get more, call in laborers from the other towns, explain it to that captain. He needs more workers to sweep up his camp. And when the captain refuses, keep pretending you don't know what the hell he's talking about. You're good at that anyway, then go ahead and do it. That is always a good trick. The officers are the key. Leave them for the best of your men. With the head gone, the Americans lose their spirit, and our people will leave no one alive. She keeps repeating the plan. Sometimes the chief forgets the details, but in truth, he's soft-hearted. For instance, Bumpus, the lieutenant, that alcoholic, the chief says, he's so nice. He likes Bumpus because the chief can beat him at chess. And the doctor, the chief says, he's a good man who just likes to talk. He's just a harmless chatterbox. Sus Maria. Kasiana thinks, men have the hearts of babies if you do not keep them in line. So she keeps repeating the details to the chief. The women must be told so they can escape ahead of time. The pigs must be sacrificed. The fiesta strategy must not be suspected. Anyway, easy to indulge these drunken Americanos in their gluttonous ways. Lastly, disguise your men. The Americanos will be suspicious if they see no women at Mass in the morning. I will make sure the wives leave their skirts behind. So many things to think about. And the chief, that chestnut, is her lone confidant. The mayor, Kapitan Abayan, is still pretending to be deaf and dumb with too much conviction and just keeps petting his chickens when she gives him the lowdown, when she goes near. Even the priest looks a bit distracted when she tells him, though he was in on the idea from the start. He's threatening to leave when the going gets tough. But that's a man of the church for you. And so it is up to them, the women. Kasiana hates having to carry the heavy tubes of water up to the plaza, where the town used to hold the fiesta dances, and now the Americanos have taken up the space. She wishes she could just scrape this occupation away, and all these men, like the snot of silot across a cracked coconut, or like the sins from her chest. The way Padre Donato says, she should just wipe her bloody sinful thoughts away with prayer. Her father is in their prisons for being a man, for having two hands that can work, that can hack at his land, two jails that fit a dozen, but with 82 men packed in. Every morning when they are released from their masked misery, she looks out for her father. He has those wide cheeks which stretch even wider when he smiles. His smile, before the Americanos came, used to be so broad it reached his sun-scorched ears. He has lost it. Sometimes she does not recognize her father, looking like all the others, skinny, grave, and beaten. He has worked so hard on his lands that his rice fields once stretched to the edge of the forest, almost to Hiporlos. The captain had commanded him to burn his granary, a blasphemy against God. Benito Nacionales refused. Sus Mariosep. Kasiana crossed herself at the mere shadow of the expression of the thought. Burn the rice. What kind of a devil, demonyo nga yawa nga iya iroy, commands the unmentionable act, then goes to church the next day. She saw them take her father, hands tied behind his back. She saw them carrying their water containers and their hemp ropes for their cure. They spread out his arms and his legs, tie him up in their contraption, a metal crucifix. They put a stick in his mouth and a gauze cloth over his face. They pour water over the thin cloth mouth. The stick cracks his jaw open as he cries, his mouth full of their oaths and his eyes wide open. His belly will bloat. He will drown in his tears. This water is no cure. It is a curse. Captain Conyo, she said. Let him go. I will do it. The smell of the smoke was so strange and unknown to the people of Balangiga that the women came out from their huts, looking about for its source, its scent. They gazed out toward the edge of the forest, to the granary of the family, Nacionales. The strange scent of burning trailed the riverbanks down Balangiga toward San Roque, out by Giwan and Hiporlos. The news spread through their noses, the sweet and terrible smell, this news that was not benevolent, the news of burning rice. And the smog and the scent billowed over Balangiga as Kashana burned the rice. And though it was not yet angelus, people stopped in their tracks as they hacked at wood, set the table for their absent men, fed their pigs. They stopped, crossed themselves, and mumbled the prayer. It sounded like insurrection. What kind of a devil burns the rice? And after she did it, she watched her friend, the red man Frick, and Markley, the orderly, bear her father away from his ordeal in Samar, from their bamboo buckets and their water cure. In this noon heat, she watches her father take his bolo knife from the sentry. Benito Nacionales accepts his own farm tools from the American arsenal of confiscated weapons without complaint. He will never be the same. All day for weeks, laborers hack at the grass, clean up the yards, make fences, cut down palm trees against the beach. For what? So insurrectos will be visible if they attack? So insurrectos will starve because they will not have rice? Damn, damn, damn the insurrectos. It occurred to Casiana, who had always believed it a mere story, a separate thing, this revolution that was a plot beyond their lives. It meant nothing to her. But that's it, she thought. That is who we are. Insurrectos. That is how she explained it to the women. We are the insurrectos. There is no one else to do it but us. How strange it is to understand finally who she is. Insurrecto. And they agreed. And why is this goddamn man's hands always up his dick?
Thank you, Gina. So now Gina will be in conversation with the great Sabina Murray, and I'm holding this book so you can receive my subliminal messaging indicating that you should buy the book in the other room. But Sabina is a masterful writer, also investigator of the age of exploration, the scramble of Africa, and strange ability to combine lyricism and slapstick. But let's give them both a hand. Whoa. Sorry.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here, and I'm sure that you're excited to hear Gina go into a little depth about what she read. I, of course, prepared questions, and I'm ready to throw those out the window and just start in, because there are a couple of things. I mean, I've read Insurrecto a couple of times.
Yes. You were one of the very early readers One
and
of the first
supporters.
readers of Insurrecto.
Yeah. And it's just hearing that piece again, I'm again reminded that Gina, as a writer, does many things. She's written for the New York Times. She's done these analytical essays. She's an amazing critic. She's a great comprehender of Borges and able to put him into a complete, just in the register with theory and all of this, and is very well read with philosophers and great thinkers. So she's a tremendous mind. And I'm wondering, as somebody who knows all of these things, and in this moment, why do you think that a novel, novels in general, but this novel was important for you to write now?
Okay, so that's very interesting and very big.
Yeah, it's big.
It's very big. But okay, if we're talking about now and this weird way in which we can't figure out fiction from fact. I mean, we have all these weird, stupid fake news things and ways in which we can't figure out. We actually can, but people pretend that they can't. Especially journalists, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But the novel has always understood itself. I mean, starting with Aristotle, to be honest, starting with the Poetics, the work of fiction, even with Aristotle said, history is facts, fiction is truth, art is truth. And I think that's for me, I start with, I'll start with the ancient Greeks. So I'll start with Aristotle, who was championing art versus his teacher, Plato, who said the artist should be kicked out of the Republic. So I'm going to go with that in that sense. Yeah. I will also go with the fact that for me as a Filipino, the novel is actually central to my notion of the self, because there is one sense in which the novel in the Philippines created the concept of nation. And I don't think it is too much of a stretch to say that Jose Rizal, the Filipino national hero's novel, and to be honest, it was a first novel. He was in his goddamn 20s. The Noli Me Tangere, Touch Me Not is the translation of that. In some ways created the novel. So I'm very aware of the novel as a construction that produces reality, or at least attempts truth. And so I think in our current state, where this seeming, I think, blurring, where people pretend that they can't figure out what's truth versus what's made up. I think it's really made up. I don't really think that this fake news thing is. I don't. Anyway, I think the novel, which attempts to do truth in this other way, in a more, and I'm going to say this because I'm a school teacher. I teach high school, and I really believe in figuring out how my students will consider an ethical way of dealing with their lives. And because the novel works in many ways with that, because you're looking at a much broader way of thinking about truths. Mm-hmm. You're not just dealing with facts. You're not just dealing with what's happening right now. You're looking at a trend. You're looking at a history. And history is very much part of that concept of the novel. Especially with the Philippines. In the Philippines, history is very much a part of the concept of the novel, because we start with Jose Rizal. And we're very lucky as Filipinos to start with Jose Rizal. I will say that. And so a novel constructed the Philippines, and that to me is truly powerful. So I go with that.
Yeah. It's also interesting when you're writing about, because I know that one of the big things, it's impossible to escape the specter and the continued manipulations of colonialism if you're writing about the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting to me, hearing you read from this latest thing, is how you had set up Kashana and what is his name, the soldier, this Mr.
Randall.
Syphilis.
Yeah,
Randall's
he's supposed to be Gamblin, but the lady, the daughter of Gamblin is still alive, so I didn't want to go into Gamblin.
Yeah, but you're talking about this woman who's healthy, yet yet not in a strong position, sidling up to this syphilitic, beastly male. And it seemed to almost gender colonialism in a really interesting way.
Yeah.
In addition to racializing it, it seemed to
Yes.
gender it. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little, because I found it really interesting hearing it. this
Yeah,
time.
that's a thank you, because that, to be honest, no one really talks about that. But the fact is, it's about women. The
Yeah.
novel is being talked about. When I read the reviews, it seems to be about, you know, the war in general. But the novel itself is turning around even Filipino nationalist concepts of the war, because because women are really narcotized from the story. But the fact is, you cannot imagine any kind of war in the Philippines without women. I'm sorry, you know, they have control over the food. So you know, and food is really important. You know, so of course in the Philippines, it's not completely narcotized, because there's that avenue in Quezon City, Tandang Sora, which is the lady in Quezon City, now it's Quezon City, who gave all the food to very early on in the revolution. And in the Ilocos War, the war in the north in the Philippines, it completely freaked out American soldiers, apparently, because they would start the battle with women marching towards the white people. And the guys apparently were like, it would really weirded them out. And of course the women would kind of fall down, and then it would be all these men who would actually die. So so women were very much a part of the war, and I just wanted to bring women into the colonial history. And I just think Filipinos are kind of, Filipinos are like a misogynistic matriarchal culture. Just as they're like homophobic, pro-gay, you know, whatever. So, you know, do you understand that? That they're homophobic, but they're pro-gay. Because
Yeah.
they will defend their gay children to death, but they're homophobic. And it's matriarchal because your mom really matters. You will not do shit against your mom. You will die, you know, if you do shit against your mom. But at the same time, they erase women, you know, from the history. So I just wanted women in this anti-colonial story. And so it's around 6 women.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and there's a sense that in this novel, you know, it's Insurrecto, and there's a lot of stuff that it's battling against.
Yes.
That it's what if you were to break it down to like the 3 major, because there are about 1 million things that this novel is. It is being an insurrecto against the idea of novel, the idea of literature, the idea of
idea
kind
of
of
history,
a hegemonic literature.
The idea of history,
It's
the
underground.
idea of theory even, or I wouldn't be able to to do it 3 or whatever.
5.
Yeah.
5.
So there's the fact of the novel, and the fact that the realist novel, as known to us through, and I truly I love her. I mean, Jane Austen. I used Jane Austen for my novel. I used her ways of dealing with narration. You know, her free and direct discourse is very much part of my novel. And I studied her in order to do this novel. I studied her and Henry James. But I didn't, but Austen wouldn't recognize my novel in a way that a novel is supposed to be done. So there's something about the novel. So there's something about art making that's going on in the novel. There's something about women where you narcotize or you erase the very quotidian lives of women, which are really powerful, and in fact, they drive, I think women drive history, but that fact is not set up because history has been made by men for whatever reason. I mean, Virginia Woolf talks about the fact that men have used women as their mirror to bloat themselves, to make themselves look bigger. And women have, for whatever reason, been kind of not coerced, but moved into that space of the mirror of men. But what that, I think, does not exactly see is that women are therefore at the heart of all history. And I think that's one thing that I wanted to do with the novel. The other ones are just really plays on different kinds of writers that I've been working with, working through. Like, I had to say, I love Edgar Allan Poe. So I love the mystery novel. And so I start with a mystery writer. I love the locked room puzzle. And for me, the locked room puzzle has many, many. The locked room puzzle in Poe is that you can't figure out how you can get in, and you can't figure out how you can get out. That's the problem with the locked room puzzle. That's the thing that the detective in Poe is trying to figure out. For me, colonization is like a locked room puzzle. You can't figure out how you got in, and you can't get out. Colonization is eternal, because the effects of colonization you can't get rid of. The novel is also about grief, about how to deal with trauma. I mean, there are women who they're dealing with personal trauma, they're dealing with historical trauma. The frame of the story is historical trauma, but the women have personal trauma, and grief too, in my view, is a locked room puzzle. So I used Poe, and Poe is very central to two other writers that people have mentioned in terms of this novel, Borges and Nabokov.
Yeah.
And I have a student here, Izzy. Izzy's here. I have a student here I taught her, sophomore year and senior year. And to think about that, I taught Borges and Nabokov, and I teach them to high school kids. And there are all of these aspects of reading Borges, for instance, who's Argentinian, and truly it was a colonized place, Argentina, but very different from the Philippine colonization. But I do recognize that the forms of narration from Borges are very much part of the work that I do.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about colonialism and this locked
room puzzle. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the identity of your characters and where they would be without, just sharpen it. Maybe these are things that you know of living with colonialism, but maybe something for a broader audience, what it's like to construct an identity that has grown around colonialism.
Yeah. Could I just talk, I'll just talk very briefly about the way I grew up. I grew up in Leyte. It's a central Visayas, it's called in the Visayas. It's a central island of the Philippines. It's definitely not central because central in the Philippines is in the north, it's in Manila. And Manila is the Tagalog province. If anyone knows anything about the Philippines, the language is Tagalog. But to be honest, the language most spoken in the Philippines is Visayan. So that's Cebuano. So I grew up with some Cebuano. I grew up with Waray, though, which is even more marginalized because there are only 2 provinces in the Philippines that speak Waray. And that's my province, Leyte, and Samar. That's why I wrote about Balangiga. Because to be honest, I always felt that Balangiga, even though it was a different province, was about my group of people.
Yeah.
So I grew up speaking Waray, but I wasn't allowed to speak Waray in school. I was fined for speaking Waray in school. I was supposed to speak in English. So it's a profound split in one's identity when the thing that is very primal to you, which is your language, your goddamn mom's language, it's your mother's language. As Eric calls it, tang ina. It's the tang ina. So sorry for Filipinos, don't really get if you're not Filipino, you don't get it. Putang ina means, so puta is whore and mother is ina. So your mother is a whore. But Eric has an essay called Tang Ina. And that it's so primal to you that you have this language issue. So I always had this language issue where my actual language, that I thought was my language, was repressed, and the language of privilege was English. And here's the thing, I was very good at it. I was very good at English. I understood grammar. There was something about learning another language that was just very easy for me. And it was very problematic for me when I learned that it wasn't as easy for my classmates. It was not as easy. So you're already marginalized in your own goddamn educational system. So when I came to the States and I recognized that, wow, my English, which gave me privilege, came from this violence. So the identities of the people in the novel have to do with these various recognitions of their positions in terms of this violence. That's how I would say it.
Yeah, and some are in this novel, which I find very interesting about it, is it seems like the perfect storm
Yeah.
to illustrate so many of these forces of
Yes.
history. And interesting to note, recently there's been a development with the Balangiga bells.
The
What's happening
bells.
with the Balangiga bells?
The bells were returned. The bells, there were 3 bells looted from Balangiga, and they were looted by people who weren't from that 9th Infantry. They weren't from Randall's infantry. They were looted by 10th Infantry. I don't know what, whatever. But for military people, it really matters that a different group took the bells and then made it a trophy in their in Wyoming. The 9th Infantry is a New York infantry. It's a New York regiment. So there were all of these military. So anyway, it was returned. They were all returned through the efforts of citizens in Balangiga and veterans in the United States, and the daughter of Gamblin. Sorry, I made her.
You said it.
Yeah, I did. I dare say. So the daughter of Gamblin, who said to the U.S. Congress, the bells must be returned. So I think that story also of Balangiga, which is about, it's not about reconciliation. I wouldn't say reconciliation is the term, but I would say it's about recognizing the multiple ways in which one would experience an event, and just saying there are multiple ways, but there is an ethical way. Yeah. And the ethical way. So even though with empathy, you will think about all the different perspectives. As a writer, I had to really empathize with Randall's the sergeant. I had to figure out why he was there. And to be honest, my empathy for him was the fact that he's a worker like me. I'm a teacher, he was a soldier. And they are workers, and they have to do this job. And they have to do this job because they need to survive. You know, the white soldier in 1901 was just as abused in many ways. Well, not the same as the people in Balangiga, but they were very abused. So I had to think about empathy as a writer, but empathy is not ethics. I could still take sides. And to take sides with the people of Balangiga, because they were the ones whose church bells were stolen, whose town was occupied, whose rice fields were burned, whose people were, well, actually, here's the weird thing. The irony is the Balangiga people were not killed because they knew what they were going to do. They escaped to the mountains. The lady in Balangiga that I was talking to and said, so how do people view it now? And she goes, well, we're sorry that we didn't tell our neighbors. You get that? But the empathy of that woman to say, after all these years, we're sorry we didn't tell our neighbors. And Balangiga, unlike the Vietnam War Memorial, which has the names of American dead, Balangiga has the names of the Filipino dead and the American dead. And I think that's really important, you know, to think about with the way to think about the novel.
No, definitely. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Your book has had a surprisingly erudite,
positive, yeah.
I wasn't going to say positive, but people have really understood this book.
Yeah.
And the way that it's been reviewed has been, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised that you got really thoughtful, careful, penetrating interviews in this book. And it made me think, maybe there's something happening in the American reading public that they're actually open to this book. And now I will ask you to speculate wildly. What in the current cultural moment do you think has made them more accepting?
To be honest, I can't speculate. I find it very difficult. I don't know. I really don't know. Readership is not something that I think a writer readership is something that you think about when you're writing, but I don't know if you can think about it when it's done. You know.
Do you think that there's something in the American, because it was not a book. I would consider Insurrecto as a book on one level is definitely written for Filipinos, because there's stuff in there that Filipinos will, understand, that there is kind of, it's almost like a trauma, but it's, if there's a positive thing that's trauma that reverberates like trauma but is always happy, there's that thing where you inherit Elvis.
Yeah.
And he is in your DNA.
Yeah.
So there are parts of that do seem very much geared towards Filipinos, but there's a part of it where it breaks open and it says, I am to people who understand colonializing forces, I am to people who understand victimhood, I am to people who understand the aftermath of war.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've heard, okay, so I was just this weekend, I was talking to a person. He has a radio show in Texas, and I boycott Texas. I boycott Texas, Florida, all those things. Anyway, so I was talking to him, and he was saying that, oh, it's so interesting. I didn't know that Filipinos liked Elvis, and it just never occurred to him that Filipinos would like Elvis, which for me is like, whoa, that's really weird. I didn't say that to him because I'm listening to him and I'm recognizing, the stuff that I know is not the stuff that he knows. And I just need to see that. I just need to see that my experience is not everyone else's experience. And again, I'm a school teacher, so all I do is like listen to children. And so to recognize, like I'm always recognizing, and it's actually a gift. It's a gift that a writer might have because you're hearing how other people listen to you. It's a gift that a teacher has because you're hearing how all of these different people read one text. And while the students don't know all the different ways that text is being read, I know because I've been teaching for like 35 goddamn years. So, so I think that one thing is that this interesting gap that the novel provides to both Filipino-Americans, Americans, and even some Filipinos is an opening for them that's actually in some ways a kind of jubilee, a kind of celebration to recognize that, oh, now I'm learning something. Now I'm getting to know a little bit more without. I'm hoping that it's without guilt, because to be honest, white guilt is completely useless. There's no goddamn reason for planting or making, prominent in you white guilt. Because what you have to do is move beyond it. Say, okay, this happened in my history, and then just say, I'm not going to let that happen again. You have to move into a more activist space. For me, the emotional space, that's good, but the activist space is where you should be.
Okay, good. Okay, I'm going to see if people want to ask questions. Should I just go forward with the mic, or do you have? Okay. Any questions for Gina?
I just want to acknowledge that Jessica Hagedorn is here.
Yes, I know.
Wow.
I'm going to cry again, but my debt to Jessica is so huge. The way she's been. I grew up in the Philippines, and Filipino writers are really obnoxious and nasty. And I came to America, and I met Jessica, and it's like, I just want to acknowledge that Jessica came to this reading. It's just, thank you, Jessica.
Okay. Hi. Hi. We talk a lot about colonization in the book, but I was wondering also about the angle of diaspora, because it's really powerful in there. Could I hear a little bit about it?
Thank you for asking that question.
Welcome. I'm not a plant, I promise.
Magsalin is the one. Magsalin is the plant. of the diaspora. She's a translator. And for anyone who, actually no one knows this, but Magsalin is the middle name of Crisostomo Ibarra in Rizal's Noli. So if you're a Filipino who's read the Noli and you forgot that the name of Crisostomo Ibarra is Crisostomo Ibarrazeta y Magsalin. So Rizal from the very beginning was postmodern and recognized these ways in which the Philippines is connected to all of these other places. So for me, the diasporic part of the novel, which is Magsalin, the translator who lives in New York and goes back home, and it's through her that you get a glimpse of how you grow up in the Philippines and what it means to grow up in the Philippines and then leave and then return. And it does go back to Rizal in the sense that the Rizal novel is about a return of a Filipino who grew up in Manila. Actually, he grew up in Laguna, and then came back, went to Spain, and then came back. And that's very much a story of too many Filipinos. A lot of the Filipinos, though, don't return. A lot of times, the return is in the imagination. And in this novel, she actually returns, and not only that, she just does not give a fuck about this white filmmaker and just does whatever she wants to do with that filmmaker's script. Also, there's a sense that she made up the white filmmaker. So the diasporic part is a power part. It's giving agency to the story, in which your story, in my research on the novel, on the Filipino-American War, I could not find the Filipino voice in the Filipino-American War. That is really why I wrote the novel. Why the novel is constructed in this way. Because I wanted to find the voice of the Filipino in the Filipino-American War. There was only one diary, but no diary about the quotidian aspects of this war from a Filipino. You get a lot of American voices. I read Helen Taft's memoir of her being in the Philippines, because her husband, William Howard Taft, was the Governor General before he became president, and a really bad justice, but whatever. And all of these American women who traveled, but you didn't get the Filipino voice. So Magsalin, the diasporic voice in the novel, is the one that I moved into the Filipino voice. And she overtakes everyone.
Hi. There were some references about this in the text and a few key scenes, but I was wondering to what extent you wanted current events, especially regarding the Duterte administration, how much you wanted that to be in the book.
I often read the other part there where of the Duterte part where there's the child who dies, because I was very, very, very much affected by the fact that children are dying in Duterte's war, so-called war against drugs, which is really a war against slum dwellers. It's really a slaughter of poor people in the Philippines. And I had begun the novel before Duterte came to power. But on the day Duterte came to power, I already published 2 op-eds on the horror of Duterte. And I already knew, because I was working on my novel, I already knew, okay, what do I do to get this shit in there? And the weird thing is that it was very easy. That was the horrific aspect of this novel, that in the beginning was tying the Filipino-American War to the Marcos dictatorship, because it was an Apocalypse Now novel. And when Duterte came to power, the horrific thing about it was that it was so easy to add one more death, one more violence upon Filipinos. And for me, that was horrific to think of. I did it anyway. I mean, I just thought I'll do it. It came later on in the novel. If you notice, in the novel. It's all in the chapter 1 chapters. There are like 20 chapter 1 chapters in the novel, and the chapter 1 chapters are the trip to Samar, and that was much later in the novel. So I felt a weird obligation to make the connections, because to be honest, when you see the deaths, the photographs of the deaths of the Duterte drug war, there isn't a huge difference between those deaths and the photographs of the Filipino dead in the Philippine-American War. And that's what's horrifying about it, you know, where Duterte is the Americano in this horror. You know, where he's saying that he's a rebel who's anti-American, he's actually, in my view, the Americano, because it's not about, in some ways, it's about the power structure. Who's killing whom and why are they killing? And they're killing for the same reasons, for othering. He's othering people who do drugs. And that same othering of Filipino revolutionaries in the Philippine-American War, communists in the Marcos War, poor people who do drugs. And it's horrific. I think it's really wrong.
Hello. I kind of have a long-winded two-parted question for both of you. I haven't read Insurrecto yet, but I'm very excited to read it. And having read
I'm very
Sabina,
disappointed.
I just bought the copy tonight, and I'm gonna get it signed by you. But I did read Valiant Gentlemen, and I'm kind of seeing a connection here. So let me just go ahead and dive into my question. What were the connections conjured for both of you writing your books between patriarchy, men, and colonialism? And both of your books kind of feature women who are kind of retelling that history. And how do they kind of interact with that?
Well, it's because we have dinner together and we get drunk together.
Yes, we do. Yeah, well, I think when I wrote Valiant Gentlemen, it is kind of hilarious because you write a book about, I guess, one historically significant man, the man he's in love with, and that man's wife. And so many people say, I really like the voice of the wife. And when I was putting that together, of course, the research goes around this. The character is Roger Casement, he's a tremendous humanitarian. He goes to the Congo in the 1880s. He writes about the atrocities being committed against the natives by King Leopold in the rubber trade. And then it just follows him to the time when he realizes that he really wants to be a nationalist in Ireland and get the English out of Ireland. So it follows that arc. But the character that I had commenting on this is the woman, the wife of his friend, who's Sarita Bort, and she just has a much more, perhaps because she's more grounded in the day-to-day, in the quotidian.
Yes.
It gives a much stronger sense of what it would be like to live in that time and to really be confronting these ideas. And especially because we don't have a women's perspective most of the time. Because I read book after book, and even Sarita's book is all about her husband. She doesn't put herself in there at all, except as a lens to see what her powerful husband. The mirror.
Who bloats the male.
She does. She distorts him. There's no way that he was as cool as she said that he was. And I just completely disregarded everything she said and was like, he was probably more like this. And that just seems more realistic. But, you know, it's true that no matter, if you grow up in a country that flags its colonialism with such zeal, I won't say pride, but with such zeal as the Philippines, colonialism is inescapable. Even looking at me, colonialism is inescapable. I cannot escape colonialism when I look in the mirror. And I feel 100% Filipino, and at the same time, very much American, Chinese, Spanish. Like, what else do I have going on there? I am like a walking advertisement of colonialism. I am colonialism. So, and I think
Well,
about
your
that.
great grandfather was in the Phil-Am War.
He was. He was a cook. He didn't kill anyone. He was little. And then in the Second World War, he was in prison. He was in prison with Jessica's grandfather. They were there together in the camp. Yeah.
Yes,
Who
Fort
knew?
Santiago.
Yeah, welcome to colonialism. So it's impossible to, hi.
Hi,
So you
coloni-
can't-
Hi, colonialism.
Hi. You too can know colonialism. Anyway, so you can't get away from it. So no matter what I write, it always is somehow tied in with these structures, with these power structures, and how people find their identity growing out of this, how they define themselves. Because you can't rip out the whole history of, white domination in countries like the Philippines and then say, okay, now we have the real Filipino because of the way people have grown in together. It's just a very bizarre thing, but it's something that I think bears repeated study.
Yeah. And I know that both of us have talked about this weird this heart of darkness. It's a basic heart of darkness thing. And my novel was originally called The Unintended,
Yeah.
which is a riff on The Intended, the woman at the end of Heart of Darkness to whom the Marlowe gives Kurtz's letters. And what I wanted to do at first with my novel was to do the other intended, which is the African woman or the woman of color version of the story of Kurtz. So I know that you're very, because of course Conrad was in your novel.
Conrad is in my novel,
Yes.
and The Unintended is also in the novel that I'm writing. Like, we're
Yes.
both
Yeah,
trying
yeah,
to do
so
it,
that-
and I'll
yeah,
probably end
Yeah,
up
we
not
just
getting-
plagiarize. We just plagiarize each other's
Yeah,
interests.
we inspire
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
each other.
And I think that's one thing also about literature that you don't hear a lot about kind of women writers.
Yeah.
Because it's all about Philip Roth or Hemingway and Fitzgerald, etc. But I think it's really important to recognize the kind of sisterhood, kind of
Yeah.
a way in which women writers, gain from each other.
Hi, Gina. Thanks for the book, or the novel. Hi. Well, I've read the book, and I'm a slow reader, but every day that I was reading the book, it seemed like a gift. The pages.
Thank you.
Yeah, there was always something to be discovered. Some poetic stuff that was amazing. Whether I was reading in the bedroom, the living room, or the toilet.
I read in the toilet every day.
Well, what struck me, I mean, you were born in the Philippines. I was also born in the Philippines. But what struck me in the book was how not just the Filipinos, but the American women, the photographer, the American soldiers, the Coppola-like director in the 60s or 70s, the wife, and then the Chiara, in the contemporary pages. I mean, they were just as memorable, as wittily described, wittily emphasized as the Filipinos. And I was wondering, what kind of balancing act did you do? Because they were just also, the world was just so full and, for all these people, not just the Filipinos. And going back, I'm a bit fascinated by how you constructed the novel, because it's non-linear, and it jumps from one era to another, 60s, early 1900s. Did you start with a linear framework and then just juggled it all up? It's fascinating.
No. I always started the main metaphor. I really like structure, like thinking about structure. Like Gun Dealer's Daughter was a linear structure, A to B, and then it became a circle. And this one was for me a weave, an abaca weave, like a mat. So everything is crisscrossing. Everything is crisscrossing. There are different parts, and they just kind of cross. And abaca is actually very central to the Samar thing, because it's the reason why the Americans were in Samar was because of the hemp, because they needed hemp for their military, for their naval stuff, because you needed the ropes for the rigging, and so it was really important for them. So they wanted the abaca. So for me, also being from Leyte, where abaca is really important, you know, my family owned abaca and all of these things, you know, where you have the farms. So the structure was always multiple, but how that multiple, how the multiplicity was going to happen, I didn't know, you know. So all these different strands, and being able to, I have to say, I read a lot of colonial commentary on the Philippines. So I read a lot of white people talking about the Philippines, because that's the only thing I could get. It was very sad. There are lots of diaries about the Spanish War, the war against Spain, Filipinos talking about the Spanish War. There's only one diary, and it was a confiscated diary of Simeon Villa, who was the doctor of Aguinaldo. And Simeon Villa was the father of Jose Garcia Villa, the great Filipino poet in English. And it was of the time. So there are no diaries just talking about that war. I actually have a great uncle who was the leader of the military in Leyte. But when I asked his great-grandchild, so what did your grandfather say? Nothing about the Philippine-American War. So I read a lot of white people on the war, so I had a lot of empathy for white people. Whatever. And so I kind of understood the way they spoke. And to be honest, if you're a writer, you have to have that empathy. There's no way out for you. If you have characters in your novel, and no matter what you think about them empirically, as an empirical person, as a person who's just a person, and you hate them all, there's no way out for you if you hate them when you're writing them. You have to understand them. And to be honest, I think that for me is why writing is really important, and why I make my students write creative writing, because it's really important to get that sense that you are not you. There's this person there. You need to understand that person, and it doesn't matter what your feelings are. That person has his or her own desires, his or her own motives, and you need to get at that heart. And if you don't do that, your book is fucked. Shall we end with fucked?
Right.
Yeah, one more fucked.
I don't know if this is a question really, but I've been thinking about the question you tried to ask earlier about the pleasant surprise of the reception for Gina's latest
Yeah.
work. And I've had the privilege of knowing both of your works. You've been at this all along. We all have. But
We met because of
because
the event that you organized.
But I'd read Slow Burn. I mean, you know, for those of you who don't know, she's had this body of work, Gina, here in the Philippines. And, you know, the first time I ever met you, you gave me a copy of, I don't know if you remember that. Yeah. Well, it was amazing.
Very forward of me.
Come on. Really. I mean, I know we have a time thing, but I just wanted to ask both of you. And, you know, Sabina here, you know, you were both in the Charlie Chan anthologies, but I'd been reading your work, and I've continue to read your work, and I'm wondering, I know you were trying to get at something with that question. I'd love to hear more from you, Sabina, about what about this moment for Gina
Okay.
strikes you? I know there's something, there that you want to get at.
Well, the obvious and clear and false response would be that Duterte has been in the paper, and all of a sudden people remember that there's such a nation as the Philippines because people are being gunned down there, and they want to read something by a Filipino. But there are a lot of Filipinos, and we're all writing all the time. I mean, maybe not all of us, but a lot of us
There's quite
are.
a few Filipino-American writers now. I mean, really a lot, considering
and
who was here.
it makes you pleased. It makes
Yeah.
a person happy. But Gina writes this great Borgesian novel that, in a real modernist vein, tries to talk about the dislocation of how we feel right now and goes at it formally. It goes at it intelligently, yet formally. It takes this fractured moment where no one can make sense of anything, and it creates an articulate language that we can actually follow through. So yes, it's the Philippines, and it's Balangiga, and it's one moment in history, and it's the present, and it's hinting at the future. And yes, it talks about gender, and it steals back a narrative from a largely male-dominated history. But at the same time, it creates a form where, as we're all dealing with a moment in time, that with false news and climate change and whatever, it feels very much like a gear-changing moment, akin to that moment in history that gave birth to a movement like modernism. So I think, in a way, artistically, this book it touches Borges in a way, it acknowledges the past, but it moves forward in something that feels a little more, in a romantic vein, that's taking from the headlines, that's saying, yes, I'll look at Conrad, I'll look at Borges, I'll look at Poe, but I will also look at not Francis Ford Coppola necessarily, but the kind of the more poppy Sofia Coppola and, clowns in Cubao and all these other things. And I will say, yes, that's also art. And I think that that's part of it, is that we're looking at this incredibly fractured reality and we're saying, you know what? This is what we're going to get our art from. We can't quite get a handle on it, but this is the moment that's inspiring us. So I think that Gina's book, Insurrecto, is one of the first out of the gate that's understanding this and presenting it to an interested public.
So there you go, and that's where we should end.